Hi, YouTubers, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, unwanted pets and relatives. It's Mr. Palumbo here, and today we are going to discuss the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. Now, unfortunately, this amendment is very politicized. This being an educational video, I'm going to try to, as best I can, to keep the politics out of it. Well, before we get started, let's have a reading of the Second Amendment, shall we?
2. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Now, it's funny that a sentence can be such a controversial thing, but as you'll learn if you go to law school, such is the way it is. Now, there's two basic interpretations, two camps, if you will, and these are the two camps we will look at today. There's another one, but generally it falls into these two camps. The first camp is the individualist interpretation. Now, the individualist interpretation sees the Second Amendment as a guarantee that the individual citizen has a right to keep and bear arms. There's also the collectivist or the state interpretation. This interpretation basically says the Second Amendment guarantees the individual states the right to keep a militia and protect themselves from any foreign aggressors or an encroaching federal government. Who's correct? I would say they both are. I'm going to try to argue that, yes, the Second Amendment protects the individual's right to keep and bear arms. And I think I'll give you a sensible and historical reason why. And I'll also share with you that the collectivist view is also true. The Second Amendment protects the state's right to protect themselves, whether it be from a foreign invader or an all-powerful, tyrannical federal government. I also want to show that the Second Amendment boils down to its foundational meaning that everyone has a right to self-defense, a natural, God-given right to self-defense. And I hope that you can be able to see the connection between a person's right to defend themselves with a person's liberties. You strip away the government, you strip away the police, you strip away your 300-pound, 6-foot ex-Marine brother or cousin. The only person that is going to be able to protect you and yourself and your liberty may just be you. So let's get started. All right, so just for a quick recap, let's look at the two different interpretations, the two major interpretations. The first one is the individualist. They believe that the Second Amendment protects the individual's right to keep and bear arms. The interpretation of the people mean the individual people, not the state. And the National Guard, in their opinion, does not replace the militia. The collectivist view is that the Second Amendment acts as a protection for the states by way of their militias against an encroaching federal government. A well-regulated, those words mean that the states have authority to regulate firearms. And the National Guard replaces the militia. I would also say that the collectivists interpret the term the people not as individuals, but as the state. Well, what the heck is a militia? Well, depending on your political point of view, the militia today could be the National Guard, or it could be some crazy white people fully armed and wearing camo. Let's take a look at the militia a little more closely. The word comes from the Latin meaning military service, and the most generic definition is citizens called to arm to defend their communities. Well, does the National Guard fit this definition? Well, let's see. The National Guard was founded in 1901, and one of its main purposes is to support local communities during disasters and other emergencies. So that kind of seems to fit the militia definition. However, it's also used to supplement the federal military in times of war. So now we're getting a little tricky. A state militia has to be run and controlled solely by the state. And this next point, National Guard troops can be federalized by the president. This is what makes the National Guard not the militia. Again, the original intention of the militia was state controlled. So if the president has the power to federalize your so-called state troops or your National Guard troops, then it is no longer the militia set out by the founders in the Second Amendment. Well, what did the founders say about the militia? Are the militia average everyday Joes, or is the militia some kind of quasi-professional force? Well, these are just a few that I found. There are multiple pretty black and white quotes from the founders. George Mason made this quote at the Constitutional Convention, where he said, "I ask, sir, what is the militia? It is the whole people, except for a few public officials." The militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves, all men capable of bearing arms. That's Henry Lee, father of Robert E. Lee, signer of the Declaration. Henry Lee signed, he was one of the signers. And here's James Madison, known as the father of our Constitution. He says, "A well-regulated militia composed of the people, trained to arms, is the best and most natural defense for a free country." I want to key in on that last point Madison made regarding self-defense and a free state, because I like I said earlier, I think the two camps are really not mutually exclusive. Now, the founders had a different view of government and self-defense that maybe those of us in modern times do not have. They just came out of a monarchy which did not guarantee rights. We, living 230 years later, we just think these rights exist all the time because we've always had them, our parents have had them, our grandparents have had them. But the founders, it wasn't like that. And they wanted to make sure, how could we put tools and checks and balances in place that would ensure people can keep their liberty? Now, some of you might trust the police. Some of you might trust the government. Again, it wasn't that way with the founding fathers. And they believed the only way you could stay free in the end is if you defended yourself. So again, the idea of self-defense is not a uniquely American idea. It is rooted in past philosophers. I put John Locke up here in his second treatise on government. John Locke says that if a man threatens me, he puts himself in a state of war with me, and I have a natural right to defend myself. John Locke is also known as the guy that believed in life, liberty, and property, which pretty much is right out of our Declaration of Independence. So this guy really influenced the founders and how they thought about natural rights and government. In an article discussing the Lockean view of natural rights, Ronald Cherry, and I'll link to his article, wrote, "Without a right to freely act in self-defense, there is, in effect, no right to life." So again, remember what I said earlier. It's in the end, how you protect yourself and your guarantee for life might come down to your right to defend yourself. And finally, Patrick Henry, I think, really crystallizes this correlation between liberty and self-defense. He says, "Unfortunately, nothing will preserve your liberty but downright force. Whenever you give up that force, you are ruined. The great object is that every man is armed." So I wanted to show you some of what the state constitutions say. A lot of times legal scholars will, if they're trying to interpret an amendment to the Constitution, they'll look further into the state constitutions because sometimes it gives you a little more clarity. Pennsylvania was one of the first state constitutions to be ratified, and it says the people have the right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. So this is taking from the Second Amendment and clarifying it even more, that yes, you're defending your state, your home, and yourself, all at the same time. The individualist interpretation and the collectivist interpretation are both shown in this one statement, in my view. However, some people have said this is still a little too vague. For those of you who think this is a little vague, let's go to Oklahoma, a relatively recent constitution, 1907, so it's only a little over 100 years old. It says the right of the citizen to keep and bear arms in the defense of his home, person, or property, so there's kind of the Lockean trifecta there, or in the aid of the civil power, which would be the state, shall not be prohibited. So I hope I'm showing you a clear correlation between the right to keep and bear arms and the right to self-defense. So it wasn't until 2008, so about maybe 7 years from this recording, that the Supreme Court even took up this idea of whether the Bill of Rights guarantees a person's right to bear arms. It was a 5-4 decision, which is a little scary, but this shows how deeply divided the country has become on this issue. And in the Washington Post, they wrote, "The court ruled that the Second Amendment protects a personal right to keep and bear arms for lawful purposes, most notably self-defense within the home." So even the Supreme Court is agreeing with me, or I'm agreeing with the Supreme Court, that the Second Amendment is directly related to this idea of self-defense. Now, the ruling didn't eradicate all existing gun laws or restrictions. You basically just couldn't ban guns outright. Before the 1950s and 60s, mass killings and gun violence was extremely rare. But with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, other civil rights leaders, and attempted assassinations on other presidents, America started to think more about their gun laws. And here recently in the 90s and the 2000s, the just increase in school shootings, mass murder, and just atrocious acts of violence has really pricked our national conscience. But I would like to argue for those who advocate for a ban on guns that, again, if we are looking at it through a self-defense prism, banning guns is simply just going to give the criminals and the perpetrators means by which to do you harm, and it takes away your right to defend yourself. I know it seems self-evident that if we ban guns, there will be no more gun violence or violent crimes in general, but that just isn't the case. Many studies have shown that countries with no guns or very restrictive gun laws still have very violent crime, and in fact, more violent crime than the United States. Some studies have shown that after gun bans, homicide rates can go up, as in the case with Great Britain. Once they instituted a handgun ban in 1997, they saw an immediate homicide rate spike. And finally, an interesting aspect to this whole rise in gun violence and mass killings is mental illness and psychotropic drugs. One website noted that out of the 67 shooters in the last 30 years, 65 had mental illness. 55 of the 67, so roughly 80%, got their guns legally. The other found illegal means to get their firearms. In the end, the Second Amendment is about the ability to defend yourself, whether you're an individual or a citizen army within the state fighting off an external or internal threat. Thank you for watching, and this episode is over.
Nothing is over! Nothing! You just don't turn it off!